The history of early jet engine development before and during World War II in Germany is similar to the story of early British engines. In short, a guy named Hans von Ohain developed a jet engine in the late 1930s, and military leaders were far too slow to recognize that jet engines were the future of military aviation. As early proof of concepts took shape and engine design matured somewhat, the Air Ministry put out requests for jet-powered aircraft. The design of the planes proceeded much faster than the engines could be refined, and the first prototype of what became the Me-262 was actually powered by a piston engine mounted in the nose. Once proper jet engines were available, the Me-262 made its first jet-powered flight in July of 1942. A fairly large number of problems were encountered during the early testing, especially with the landing gear, but by far the biggest challenge was, unsurprisingly, the engines. The early jet engines had major reliability problems and a very short service life. Still, the Me-262s started arriving in April of 1944. The Me-262 was designed from the start to be a dedicated fighter, but strategic incompetence under poorly mustachioed fascism caused some major operational delays as the plane was adapted to add ground attack capability. Still, when the Me-262 was in the air in its intended role, it was simply unmatched in the skies, and was later described by legendary test pilot Captain Eric Brown as being, quote, "without a doubt the most formidable combat aircraft of the war." The overall combat record of the plane is hard to assess since a lot of its losses were so-called bounces, where Allied fighters would ambush 262s as they were taking off or going into land. These were recorded as regular air combat kills, which skews the statistics somewhat. Most records estimate that about 540 aircraft were shot down by Me-262s against about 100 losses of 262s, with about half of the losses being bounces outside of regular air combat, and at least 15 or so being due to engine failures in combat rather than enemy fire. Despite its extreme lethality in air combat, its impact on the war was quite limited, as Germany was already on the defensive by the time it got into service, and in the end, only 200 to 300 Me-262 jet fighters were delivered by the end of the war. What we get in War Thunder is the Me-262 A-1a. This is a jet fighter in Rank 5 of the German air tree at battle rating 7.0. The jet's primary armament is a set of four 30mm Mk-108 cannons mounted in the nose with 80 rounds per gun. There are several ammo belts available, and all of them contain highly potent Minengeschoss rounds, but the catch is that some of the shots are self-destroying shells, which limits the range of the guns. My usual preference is the Universal belt, which has mostly regular Minengeschoss rounds and only one self-destroying shot per 4. I also want to explicitly mention what you might already be aware of. The Mk-108 cannons are incredibly hard to aim. They've got severe ballistic drop, and due in part to the short barrels on this plane, the accuracy is awful, even at point-blank range. When they connect, the damage is massive, but actually landing hits can be a serious challenge. Remember, these things were intended to fire salvos of shots into large bombers. For loadouts, the Me-262 A-1a can take racks of R-4M air-to-air rockets out under the wings, either 24 or 48 of them. The rockets themselves aren't especially impressive with a small HE warhead, but the intended use in real life was again to fire salvos of them into enemy bombers. In that specific use case, they can be pretty effective in the game, but otherwise they're more of a gimmick. Now, getting into this jet's flight performance, I want to remind you of something really important. This was the first operational jet fighter in the world, and flying it in the game will make that pretty obvious. I want to be clear that my comments about this are in the context of flying the Me-262 in War Thunder in early 2025 at battle rating 7.0. The main issue is that, in that context, the jet is underpowered. The acceleration is awful, the rate of climb isn't very good, and the engine throttle response is seriously delayed, which is actually a problem pretty common to basically all early jets, in real life and in the game. Normally, my suggestion when grinding upgrades for a plane is to focus on the first couple of weapon upgrades first, but in this jet it's the opposite. Your absolute first priority is unlocking the compressor and then the engine upgrade. Unfortunately, they're in rank 2 and rank 4, so you have to upgrade some of the other stuff anyway, but within ranks 2 and 4, get those first. It's not all bad news though. The Me-262 is fairly resistant to control compression in most situations, and it's actually got a fairly good level of agility in a dogfight. That is, against some of the other jets it faces. If you get down-tiered in a super props, basically any of them will outperform you in everything except top speed and dive performance, but against other entry-level jets, you can win a lot of conventional dogfights, but you absolutely need to keep your speed up. The ideal combat speed for this jet is between about 550 and 650 kilometers an hour. If you can keep the speed in that range, you can get some good turns out of it, but remember, it's still not the best. It gets tiered into fighting Korean War-era jets, so stuff like the F-86 or even the Sea Meteor will wreck this thing in a twisting dogfight. You can deploy combat flaps up to around 550 kilometers an hour, which will help in a pinch, but with the usual caveats about reduced energy retention. When you take this jet out into air battles, you need to learn some patience. This version of the 262, the A-1a, is the first model you can get in the fighter line, which has a runway spawn instead of the strike aircraft air spawn that some of the others have. This means that, due to its low engine power, you're usually going to be lagging behind the rest of your team. So my advice is simply to not try and keep up. Side climb for a few minutes, and it will be a few minutes since your rate of climb is so awful, and hope that by the time you turn in towards the battle, most enemy climbers will have either gone down into the furball or tried to intercept someone else. If you can get into a high position with an energy advantage, you can use the jet's good dive performance for some fairly effective vulture tactics, but in a practical sense, you won't get the opportunity for that too often. Sometimes you'll get the chance to do actual bomber interceptions, and the insane firepower of the cannons, or those unguided rockets, can be pretty good for that. But there's a big problem. The Me-262's engines seem to be magnetic to bullets, especially enemy bomber gun turret fire from outside the range of your cannons. And even one or two glancing hits on one of your engines will usually cripple the flight performance of the jet. And considering it's so underpowered anyway, be careful. Consider landing to repair if you take any engine hits. I also want to take a moment and remind everyone that, as always, the footage I've included in the review was to try and show a variety of different combat situations. Ideal gameplay with this jet is basically going to be like the clip you're watching right now. Long, patient, high-speed attack passes through enemy targets, firing at point-blank range, then hit or miss, diverting off to separate and regain any lost airspeed. That's really boring to watch more than once or twice, so I didn't include too much of it. And I also wanted to make sure from the footage that it was really clear how inaccurate the jet's guns are. It's incredibly difficult to land hits, especially in deflection shots, and you generally need to lead the target more than twice what feels normal. Visually, the Me-262 is a pretty sleek-looking jet. The 3D model in the game for it is very well done, and there are even some custom skins available, but I think some of them are no longer available, so you might not see them all if you're a newer player. Overall, though, it's a really great looking plane. Landing this jet is something to practice a few times. Keep the delayed throttle response in mind and come in with a little power. No air brakes or anything, so you gotta use S-turns to dump airspeed. You can throw out the gear at a little over 400 kilometers an hour and the landing flaps a bit over 350. The cockpit for the Me-262 is old. The visibility is excellent, but the instruments are drawn instead of modeled. It's easy to fly in VR, but it could use an update. To close out on the Me-262 A-1a. This jet's guns hit incredibly hard, and it's fairly agile compared to other 1940s jet fighters. However, it's chronically underpowered. The engines are very fragile. The guns are impossible to aim accurately, and it's frequently matched against Korean War-era jets that totally outclass it. The final verdict on the Me-262 A-1a is that the runway spawn and the inaccurate cannons really hold this jet back. It's still fun to fly, but it sometimes struggles to get high-scoring matches. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.